There's nothing more heartbreaking than kindness that goes unnoticed. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the deepest love, yet the world walks by without seeing. For 7 winters, Widow Elswyth had prepared a Yuletide basket for her village square. Warm bread, dried fruits, mittens she knitted by candlelight, simple gifts left for anyone who needed them. This year, the townspeople ignored her completely. Fear had made them cold. But on the darkest winter night, the basket disappeared. Days later, a formal invitation arrived at her door dinner at the Black Keep with Lord Corvin, the mysterious noble everyone whispered about. They said he was something far older than human, something dangerous. Elswyth expected mockery or worse. Instead, she found a soul as lonely as her own, drawn to the one person who still believed in kindness. What happens when a forgotten widow's simple gift touches the heart of someone who hasn't felt warmth in centuries? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stone cottage sat at the edge of Elswyth like a forgotten prayer, its chimney sending thin wisps of smoke into the grey winter sky. Widow Elswyth, Henrik's daughter, pressed her weathered hands against the frost-covered window, watching the village below stir to life as another cold dawn broke over the mountains. 7 years. 7 winters since Henrik had drawn his last breath in the bed behind her, his calloused farmer's hands growing still in hers. 7 years of waking alone, of tending a hearth meant for 2, of speaking to empty rooms that once rang with laughter and gentle arguments about whether the barley needed harvesting. She touched the simple gold band hanging from a chain around her neck. Henrik's wedding ring, worn smooth by decades of honest work. He'd been a good man, patient and kind, with eyes the color of summer grass and hands that could coax life from the most stubborn soil. They dreamed of filling their cottage with children's voices, had prepared a nursery with carved wooden toys and soft blankets. But the children never came, and now even Henrik was gone. The village stirred below, smoke rising from dozens of chimneys, but Elswyth felt the familiar weight of isolation settling on her shoulders like fresh snow. Once she'd been welcomed at every hearth, had shared meals and stories with families throughout Elswyth. Henrik's warm nature had made them both beloved. But grief, it seemed, made people uncomfortable. The visits had grown shorter, then less frequent, until finally they stopped altogether. "Mourning brings its own mercies," she whispered to herself, Henrik's favorite saying. He'd believed in finding light even in dark times, in the power of small kindnesses to change hearts. It was why she'd started the Yuletide baskets after his death, a way to honor his memory and perhaps bring a spark of warmth to someone else's cold world. The ritual had become sacred to her. Every November, she would begin preparing, baking extra loaves of her grandmother's honey bread, drying the best apples and pears from her small orchard, spinning wool from her 3 sheep into yarn for warm mittens and scarves. By the first snows, the basket would be ready, a woven willow creation Henrik had made for their first harvest, now repurposed for giving. This year felt different, though. As she moved through her morning tasks, feeding the chickens, milking her lone cow, checking the root cellar stores, she sensed a change in the village's attitude. The few neighbors who still nodded politely seemed more distant, their eyes sliding away when she passed. Even young Marta, the baker's daughter who'd once stopped to chat, now hurried by with downcast eyes. Father Benedict was the only one who still spoke to her regularly, though even he had grown troubled of late. The elderly priest visited monthly to share tea and discuss scripture, but his last visit had been strained. He'd spoken in worried tones about the darkness growing in the mountains, about ancient fears awakening as winter deepened. "There are things beyond the forest that should stay forgotten, my child," he'd said, his rheumy eyes fixed on the dark tree line visible from her window. "Old powers that feed on despair and isolation. The Lord protects us, but we must be vigilant." Elswyth had nodded politely. But she wondered if the real darkness wasn't in some distant forest. It was right here in the village, in hearts grown cold with fear and suspicion. When had her neighbors become strangers? When had kindness become something to be afraid of? She pulled her woolen shawl tighter and stepped outside to tend her small garden. The frost had claimed the last of her winter vegetables, but the sight of her organized beds gave her comfort. Henrik had helped her plan this garden in their second year of marriage, had built the stone borders with his own hands. Working the soil felt like keeping faith with his memory. "Morning, good wife, Elswyth." She looked up to see merchant Aldrich approaching with his pack mule, the leather satchels heavy with goods from the lowland towns. He was one of the few who still used her proper title instead of simply widow, and she appreciated the courtesy. "Good morning, Master Aldrich. Safe travels to you." She straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "How fare the roads?" "Passable still, though the mountain passes will close soon." He shifted his pack, glancing toward the dark forest that loomed beyond the village. "Strange doings up there, though. Travelers speak of lights moving through the trees at night, sounds that ain't quite natural, old wives' tales," Elswyth said gently, though she'd noticed the forest seemed darker this year, more oppressive. "Fear makes shadows seem like monsters." Aldrich studied her face, then lowered his pondered voice. "Perhaps, good wife, but there's been talk in the village. Some wonder if your winter walks near the forest edge might not be wise." Heat flushed her cheeks. "My walks harm no one." "Course not," he said quickly. "Just thought you should know what's being said. People get strange notions when winter closes in." After he left, Elswyth stood in her garden, feeling the weight of isolation more keenly. Her walks, solitary journeys to gather winter herbs and clear her mind, had become suspect. Everything she did now seemed to be watched, judged, whispered about. She thought of the basket waiting in her cottage, nearly complete for this year's offering. In 3 days, Yuletide Eve would arrive, and she would carry her gift to the village square as she had for 6 years past. Each time, by morning, the basket would be gone, taken by someone who needed its warmth more than she needed the recognition. That anonymity had always pleased her. The joy was in the giving, not the gratitude. But this year felt different. This year, she wondered if anyone would take it at all. The afternoon brought a visit from young Marta, though not the kind Elswyth had hoped for. The girl approached hesitantly, wrapping her cloak tight against the cold wind. "Good wife Elswyth?" Marta's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mother sent me with a message. Of course, dear one. Come inside where it's warm." But Marta shook her head, backing away slightly. "She says—" The girl swallowed hard. "She says perhaps this year you might keep your Yuletide offering to yourself. People are frightened, what with the strange happenings. They think perhaps the old ways aren't safe anymore." The words hit Elswyth like a physical blow. "I see. It's nothing personal," Marta rushed to explain. "It's just, well, people are saying maybe we should be more careful about what traditions we keep. Father Benedict says some rituals might attract the wrong kind of attention." After the girl left, Elswyth stood in her doorway watching the village below. Smoke rose from every chimney, warm light glowed in windows, and she could hear the distant sounds of families gathering for evening meals. But she felt more alone than ever, as if an invisible wall had risen between her and the community she'd called home for 30 years. That night, she sat by her fire with Henrik's ring in her palm, remembering better times. Their courtship had been gentle and sweet, the shy farmer's son who'd left wildflowers on her windowsill, the man who'd promised to love her whether they had children or not, who'd held her through the long nights when her womb remained empty and her heart ached with disappointed hope. "What would you do?" "One," she whispered to his memory. "How do you keep giving when no one wants to receive?" The fire crackled in response, and she thought she heard his voice in the sound, warm, patient, encouraging. Henrik had never let fear stop him from doing what was right. He'd faced crop failures and harsh winters, with the same steady determination, believing that morning would always come, that kindness was never wasted. She rose and walked to the corner where this year's basket waited, covered by a clean linen cloth. Lifting the covering, she gazed at her careful work: 10 loaves of honey bread wrapped in cloth, dried fruits and nuts in small pouches, 3 pairs of mittens in different sizes, hand-knitted scarves, and at the bottom, a small wooden angel Henrik had carved in their early days together. She'd added it last year, wanting to share something precious. The village might have lost faith in her tradition, but she would not lose faith in it herself. On Yuletide Eve, she would carry the basket to the square, as she had for 6 years. If no one took it, so be it. But she would not let fear stop her from hoping that somewhere in Drealenmere, someone still believed in the power of simple kindness. Outside her window, the black keep loomed on its distant hill, a massive silhouette against the star-filled sky. For generations, that fortress had stood empty, its lord absent or dead, its halls echoing with nothing but wind and memory. But lately, she'd noticed lights flickering in its towers at night, thin threads of gold against the darkness. Perhaps the old stories were true, perhaps Lord Corvin had returned to his ancestral seat after decades away. The villagers whispered that he was a creature of darkness, a monster who fed on blood and fear. But looking at those distant lights, Elswyth felt something different. She saw loneliness, isolation, as profound as her own. "Perhaps even monsters need kindness," she murmured, surprised by her own words. The thought followed her to bed, where she lay listening to the wind howl through the mountain passes and wondering if tomorrow would bring the courage she needed to keep faith with her own heart. Morning would come, as it always did, and with it, perhaps, the chance to prove that kindness was never truly wasted, even in a world grown cold with fear. Yuletide Eve arrived with a heavy snowfall that muffled the world in pristine silence. Elswyth woke before dawn, as had become her custom on this sacred day, and prepared herself with the same careful attention she'd once given to church services. She braided her silver hair neatly, donned her finest wool dress, the deep blue one Henrik had loved, and wrapped herself in the thick cloak he'd given her for their 10th anniversary. The basket sat ready by her door, covered with the linen cloth that had belonged to her grandmother. Every item inside had been prepared with love and hope, from the honey bread that had cooled through the night to the small wooden angel that carried so much of her heart. She lifted it carefully, feeling the familiar weight of expectation and faith. The village square lay hushed under its blanket of snow, empty except for the ancient stone well at its center, and the bare-branched oak that had stood sentinel for 3 centuries. This was where she always left her offering, beneath the oak's protective spread, visible to anyone who might pass, but sheltered from the worst of the weather. Elswyth knelt and placed the basket against the oak's massive trunk, arranging the linen covering so the contents would stay dry. For a moment she remained there in the snow, offering a silent prayer that her gift would find its way to someone who needed it. The wooden angel seemed to smile up at her through the cloth. "Let this bring warmth to a cold heart," she whispered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She rose and walked home without looking back, as was her tradition. Faith required letting go, trusting that Providence would guide her offering to the right hands. The day passed quietly. Elswyth kept herself busy with small tasks, mending a torn sleeve, organizing her herb stores, reading from the Book of Psalms Father Benedict had given her. But her thoughts kept drifting to the basket beneath the oak tree. In past years, she'd felt a quiet joy on Yuletide Eve, imagining some struggling family discovering her gift, children's faces lighting up at the sight of warm mittens and sweet bread. This year brought only a hollow ache of uncertainty. As evening fell, she found herself drawn repeatedly to her front window. From here, she could just see the edge of the village square, though the oak tree remained hidden behind the baker's shop. Snow continued falling in fat, lazy flakes that caught the light from windows and transformed the world into something magical and strange. The church bells rang for evening prayer, their bronze voices carrying clearly through the still air. Elswyth watched families making their way to the service, children bundled in warm coats, parents carrying lanterns that bobbed like fireflies through the snow. Once, she and Henrik had been part of that procession, their own lantern adding to the constellation of light that marked Draelinmir's faith. Now she remained apart, watching from her window like a ghost, observing the living. The service lasted an hour, and she saw the families returning home, their voices carrying on the cold air as they called good-night to neighbors and disappeared behind warm doors. The square emptied completely, leaving only the falling snow and the ancient oak standing guard over her offering. Sleep came fitfully that night. Elswyth dozed and woke, her mind too restless for true rest. Each time she stirred, she wondered if morning would bring the familiar sight of an empty space beneath the oak, proof that her faith had been rewarded once again. But when dawn broke grey and cold on Yuletide morning, the basket remained exactly where she'd left it. Elswyth stood at her window, still in her nightgown, staring at the untouched offering. Snow had drifted around the basket's edges, but the linen covering showed no signs of disturbance. No grateful hands had lifted it away in the darkness. No desperate family had discovered unexpected blessing beneath the oak. For the first time in 7 years, her gift had been rejected completely. The day stretched endlessly before her. She went through the motions of normal life, feeding the animals, preparing a simple breakfast, tidying rooms that already sparkled with cleanliness. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the basket that sat like an accusation beneath the oak tree. By afternoon, she could bear it no longer. She donned her cloak and boots and walked to the square, ostensibly to visit Father Benedict, but really to see her abandoned offering up close. The basket looked smaller somehow, pitiful against the oak's massive trunk. Snow had begun accumulating on the linen covering, and she brushed it away gently, as if tending a grave. Elswyth. She turned to find Father Benedict approaching, his black robes stark against the white snow. His weathered face showed deep concern as he took in the scene, the untouched basket, her obvious distress. "I heard about the message young Marta brought you," he said softly. "I'm sorry for that, my child. Fear makes people cruel sometimes." "I thought perhaps one person might still have faith," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "One soul who remembered what kindness means." The priest studied the basket, then looked toward the dark forest looming beyond the village boundaries. "There are stranger happenings than usual this winter, Elswyth. People sense something in the air, something that makes old traditions feel dangerous. They're protecting their families the only way they know how. By abandoning compassion, by avoiding anything that might draw unwanted attention." That evening, Elswyth sat by her fire with Henrik's ring in her palm, feeling older and more alone than she had since the day he died. The basket still waited beneath the oak, a testament to failed hope and dying faith. Perhaps the villagers were right. Perhaps the old ways truly were dangerous now. She was preparing for bed when she heard it, a sound like wings beating against her shutters, followed by a soft thump against her door. Opening it cautiously, she found nothing but fresh snow and wind. Then she looked down. A raven sat motionless on her doorstep, its black eyes reflecting the lamplight like polished obsidian. In its beak, it held a rolled parchment sealed with dark wax. Elswyth's breath caught. Ravens were creatures of ill omen in mountain folklore, messengers of death and disaster. But this one seemed almost tame, holding perfectly still as she reached for the message with trembling fingers. The parchment was unlike anything she'd ever seen, thick and smooth as silk, colored the deep black of midnight sky. The wax seal bore an intricate design, a rose entwined with thorns, surrounded by symbols she didn't recognize. As her fingers touched the seal, it seemed to warm slightly. The raven, released the parchment and took flight, disappearing into the swirling snow without a sound. Inside her cottage, Elswyth broke the seal with careful fingers. The wax crumbled to silver dust that sparkled briefly before disappearing. The letter within was written in elegant script with ink that seemed to catch and hold the firelight. Asterisk, to the Lady Elswyth of Mere. Your gracious offering beneath the ancient oak did not go unnoticed or unappreciated. In 7 years of watching, I have observed no act of kindness more pure or selfless. I would be honored by your presence at dinner tomorrow evening if you would consent to visit one whose gratitude exceeds his ability to express it. Asterisk, asterisk. The hour after sunset would be most welcomed. My servants will await your arrival at the gates of the Black Keep. Asterisk, asterisk. With deepest respect and anticipation, Lord Corvin, Blackthorn Times. The letter trembled in Elswyth's hands as she read it a second time, then a third. Lord Corvin, the name whispered in fearful tones throughout the village, the mysterious master of the Black Keep, who was said to be more monster than man. He had taken her basket. He had been watching her for 7 years. And now he was inviting her to dinner. Fear and wonder warred in her chest as she stared at the elegant script. Every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that the villagers' warnings about ancient evils held truth. But another part of her, the part that had loved Henrik's gentle faith, that had never stopped believing in the power of kindness, whispered something different. For 7 years, someone had been watching her acts of love. For 7 years, someone had witnessed her faith, even when the village turned away. Whether monster or man, Lord Corvin had seen her when no one else bothered to look. Outside, snow continued falling over the abandoned basket beneath the oak. But in her cottage, Elswyth held an invitation that changed everything, a message that suggested kindness never truly went unnoticed, even in a world grown cold with fear. Tomorrow evening would bring answers, and perhaps, after 7 years of solitude, it would bring something else she'd almost forgotten how to hope for. Understanding. The next evening arrived with an eerie stillness that made every sound seem magnified. Elswyth stood before her looking-glass, studying her reflection with a mixture of anxiety and resolve. She'd chosen her second-best dress, the grey wool with silver clasps that Henrik had said brought out her eyes, and braided her silver hair with special care. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened his ring around her neck, the familiar weight a comfort against her racing heart. The Black Keep had loomed on its distant hill for as long as anyone could remember, but she'd never imagined herself walking its halls. Stories about Lord Corvin ranged from the merely unsettling to the absolutely terrifying. Some claimed he was an ancient vampire who fed on the blood of innocents. Others whispered he was a sorcerer who'd sold his soul for eternal life. All agreed on one thing: he was not entirely human, yet his letter had been courteous, even elegant. Someone had taught him manners, whatever else he might be. The path to the Black Keep wound through the haunted forest that surrounded Mere like a dark embrace. Ancient trees pressed close on either side, their bare branches creating a canopy of shadows overhead. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she followed the winding trail, her lantern casting a small circle of golden light in the gathering darkness. The forest felt alive around her, full of whispers and rustling sounds that might have been wind or something else entirely. Once she heard what sounded like footsteps following her, but when she turned, nothing moved in the darkness beyond her lantern's glow. The stories of wolves and darker creatures seemed suddenly very real. But stranger still was the gradual realization that she was not truly afraid. Nervous, yes. Uncertain, certainly. But not the bone-deep terror that should have accompanied a journey to meet a legendary monster. Perhaps 7 years of loneliness had worn away her capacity for fear. Or perhaps Henrik's quiet faith had left her with a stubborn belief that kindness always found a way to protect itself. The trees began to thin as she climbed higher, and suddenly the Black Keep rose before her like a mountain of carved stone. It was larger than she'd expected, its towers reaching toward the stars like grasping fingers. Gothic windows glowed with warm lamplight, making the fortress seem almost welcoming despite its imposing silhouette. Massive iron gates stood open at the keep's entrance, flanked by stone gargoyles whose eyes seemed to follow her movement. She paused at the threshold, suddenly understanding why the villagers whispered about this place in fearful tones. Everything about the Black Keep spoke of age and power, of secrets kept and prices paid. Lady Elswyth. She turned to find a figure approaching from the shadows, a woman dressed in simple grey, her face serene but somehow ageless. The servant moved with silent grace, her feet making no sound on the stone courtyard. "I am Mirabelle. Lord Corvin awaits your arrival. May I escort you inside?" Elswyth nodded, not trusting her voice. The servant led her through the gates and into a vast entrance hall that took her breath away. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, painted with frescoes of celestial scenes that seemed to move in the flickering torchlight. Tapestries covered the walls, their rich colors telling stories of battles and romances from ages past. But what struck her most was the warmth. Despite its size and stone construction, the hall felt genuinely welcoming, heated by massive fireplaces that cast dancing shadows across polished floors. The scent of burning wood mingled with something else, roses, perhaps, or some other flower that shouldn't bloom in winter. "His lordship will receive you in his study," Mirabelle said, leading her up a grand staircase, whose banister had been carved from a single piece of dark wood. "He asked me to express his gratitude for your acceptance of his invitation." They walked through corridors lined with paintings and sculptures that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and culture. Elswyth glimpsed libraries through open doorways, rooms filled with books from floor to ceiling, and chambers that seemed to have been frozen in time from different eras. The study door was carved with the same rose and thorn design she'd seen on the letter's seal. Mirabelle knocked softly, then opened it to reveal a room that felt like stepping into a scholar's dream. Books lined every wall, their leather spines gleaming in the light of a massive fireplace. A desk dominated one corner, covered with papers and instruments she couldn't identify. But what drew her attention immediately was the figure standing beside the fire. Lord Corvin was not what she'd expected. Tall and lean, he possessed an otherworldly elegance that made her think of autumn nobility, refined and beautiful, but touched with inevitable sadness. His dark hair showed silver at the temples, and his face bore the kind of weariness that comes not from age, but from having seen too much. When he turned to greet her, she found herself looking into eyes the color of storm clouds, ancient beyond his apparent years. But it was his expression that surprised her most. Not the cruel arrogance she'd imagined, not the predatory hunger of a monster, but something achingly familiar. Loneliness so profound it made her own isolation seem trivial by comparison. "Lady Elswyth." His voice was cultured, warm, with an accent she couldn't place. "I cannot adequately express how honored I am by your presence." He moved toward her with fluid grace, and she noticed he cast no reflection in the ornate silver mirror that hung beside his desk. The sight should have terrified her, should have sent her fleeing back to the village with tales of supernatural horror. Instead, she felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. "Thank you for your invitation, Lord Corvin." She was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "And for appreciating my small offering." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. "Small? My dear lady, you have no idea how precious your gift truly was. Please, sit by the fire. The mountain air is cruel to those not accustomed to its bite." He gestured to a chair positioned beside the hearth, upholstered in rich burgundy velvet that looked both ancient and perfectly maintained. As she settled into its embrace, she noticed how carefully he positioned himself, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid accidentally touching her. Even his courtesy seemed tinged with careful restraint. "Your basket," he continued, settling into the opposite chair with that same fluid grace, "contained more than bread and Mittens, for 7 years I have watched you perform this ritual of kindness. In all that time, I have never seen such pure generosity, no expectation of recognition, no demand for gratitude, simply faith that love would find its way to where it was needed most. Heat rose in her cheeks. You've been watching me. Not in any intrusive way, he said quickly, perhaps reading her discomfort. The view from my tower encompasses much of the village. I have observed many things over the years, but nothing as consistently beautiful as your annual act of faith. She studied his face, noting the careful way he chose his words, the genuine warmth in his expression. The villagers say you're a monster. A sad smile touched his lips. And what do you think, Lady Elswyth? Do I seem monstrous to you? Before she could answer, her gaze fell on the mirror beside his desk, the silver surface that reflected the room's contents but showed no trace of the man sitting across from her. The evidence was undeniable, yet somehow it didn't matter as much as she'd expected it would. I think, she said carefully, that monsters don't usually write such elegant letters or show such courtesy to lonely widows. His smile deepened, transforming his entire face. You possess remarkable wisdom, my lady, and remarkable courage to accept an invitation from someone the village fears. Perhaps fear isn't always the wisest counsel, she replied, surprising herself with the words. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them like a bridge spanning the gap between two isolated souls. Outside the tall windows, snow continued falling over the mountain peaks, but inside the study, warmth bloomed, tentative and fragile, but unmistakably real. The dining hall was a study in elegant grandeur, its long tables set with crystalline precision that spoke of centuries-old refinement. Candles in ornate silver holders cast warm light across pristine white linens, while delicate china bore the same rose and thorn pattern Elswyth had seen on Corvin's seal. Two place settings faced each other across polished mahogany, an intimate arrangement despite the room's imposing size. I confess, Corvin said as he held her chair with old-world courtesy, it has been many years since I've had the pleasure of dining with a guest. I fear my conversation may prove rusty from disuse. Elswyth smoothed her skirts as she settled into the chair, marveling at the table's beauty. Every piece of crystal caught and reflected the candlelight, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the white cloth. I suspect you underestimate yourself, my lord. Your letter showed considerable eloquence. Written words are easier than spoken ones, he admitted, taking his seat across from her. They can be revised, perfected, stripped of awkward hesitation. The first course arrived without fanfare, a delicate soup that steamed fragrant clouds into the cool air. Mirabelle served them, both with silent efficiency, before withdrawing to whatever shadows servants inhabited in this strange household. Elswyth noticed that while Corvin's bowl sat before him, he made no move to eat. Please, he said, gesturing toward her soup. Don't let my presence prevent you from enjoying the meal. My cook has outdone herself tonight. The soup was exquisite, a blend of winter root vegetables with herbs she couldn't identify, rich and warming after her cold journey. As she ate, she studied her host from beneath lowered lashes. He watched her with obvious pleasure, as if her enjoyment gave him satisfaction he couldn't find in his own untouched meal. You don't eat, she observed quietly. My dietary requirements have grown quite specific over the years, he replied with careful neutrality. But I find great pleasure in watching others enjoy good food. It reminds me of simpler times. How long has it been since you were truly human? The question emerged before she could stop herself, and she immediately regretted its boldness. But Corvin didn't seem offended. Instead, his expression grew thoughtful, distant. 347 years this winter, he said finally, though sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes like eternity. What was it like? Before? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I was the second son of a minor lord, possessed of more curiosity than sense. I had a small estate in the Loire Valley, a passion for ancient texts, and dreams of discovering forgotten knowledge. His voice carried the weight of old grief. I found what I was looking for, though it came with a price I hadn't anticipated. Do you regret it? Every day. The words were soft but absolute. Immortality sounds appealing in theory, but the reality is profoundly isolating. Everyone you love dies. Everything you build crumbles. After a time, you learn not to form attachments because the pain of losing them becomes unbearable. Elswyth set down her spoon, her appetite forgotten. Is that why you live alone here? Partly. He leaned back in his chair, candlelight playing across his angular features. But also because proximity to me can be dangerous. My nature requires certain accommodations that wouldn't be comfortable for mortal companions. The blood, she said simply. He stiffened, surprise flashing across his face. You speak of it so calmly. I've lived long enough to understand that everyone has needs, my lord. Some require food, some require solitude, some require the comfort of others. You require blood to survive. She met his gaze steadily. The question isn't what you need, it's how you obtain it. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then a sound escaped him that might have been laughter or something closer to despair. You continue to surprise me, Lady Elswyth. Most would flee in terror at such an admission. Most haven't spent 7 years learning that fear is often just loneliness dressed in different clothes. The second course arrived, roasted fowl, with winter vegetables that filled the air with savory aromas. Again, Corvin's plate remained untouched while he encouraged her to eat. Their conversation flowed more freely now, the initial awkwardness dissolving into something approaching natural discourse. He asked about her life with Henrik, listening with genuine interest as she described their simple happiness. She spoke of their shared dreams, their quiet love, the peaceful rhythms of village life before fear took hold. In return, he offered glimpses of his mortal past scholarly pursuits, a love of music and poetry, memories of a world that had vanished centuries ago. Do you ever think of ending it? She asked, during a lull in conversation. The loneliness, I mean. Often, he admitted. But ending an immortal existence requires more than simple desire, and there are responsibilities that bind me here. What responsibilities? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Ancient obligations, debts that must be honored. The world is darker than most people realize, Lady Elswyth. Sometimes it requires guardians, even unwilling ones. She sensed deeper currents in his words, but didn't press. Instead, she found herself studying his face in the candlelight, noting the lines of weariness around his eyes, the careful way he held himself apart, even in conversation. This was a man or creature who had forgotten how to hope for connection. Your basket, he said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. The first year I saw you place it beneath the oak, I assumed it was some village tradition everyone participated in. But as the years passed, I realized you were alone in the gesture. Why continue when no one seemed to appreciate it? Because appreciation was never the point, she replied. Henrik used to say that kindness plants seeds we may never see grow. The act itself has value, whether or not anyone witnesses it. Your Henrik sounds like a wise man. He was. She touched the ring at her throat unconsciously. He believed in the goodness of people, even when they disappointed him. I try to honor that faith. And do you still believe in goodness? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with his own desperate need for an answer. Elswyth considered carefully, thinking of the villagers' recent coldness, their rejection of her offering, their willingness to abandon compassion for the illusion of safety. I believe in the potential for goodness, she said finally, even in the most unlikely places. Their eyes met across the candle-lit table, and something shifted between them, a recognition that passed beyond words. Two souls who had been alone for so long they'd forgotten what connection felt like, tentatively reaching toward each other across the void of isolation. Would you, he began, then stopped, shaking his head. Forgive me. I have no right to ask. Ask what? Would you consider visiting again? No, it's presumptuous, and the village would surely disapprove. But he paused, vulnerability flickering across his composed features. It has been a very long time since I've had someone to talk with. Someone who sees beyond the surface of things. Elswyth felt her heart contract with sympathy and something else, a warmth she hadn't experienced since Henrik's death. I would like that very much, she said softly. Relief flooded his face, transforming it completely. Perhaps weekly? The winter evenings can be terribly long. Every Wednesday, she agreed, if the weather permits. My servants will always escort you safely through the forest, he promised. And if you ever feel uncomfortable or wish to discontinue, I understand. She smiled, surprising herself with how natural it felt. But I don't think that will be necessary. Outside, the wind howled around the keep's ancient stones, but inside the dining hall, two lonely souls had found something precious and unexpected. The beginning of hope. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that brought both comfort and anticipation to Elswyth's winter days. Each Wednesday, as twilight painted the mountains purple and gold, she would make her way through the forest to the Black Keep. What had begun as nervous courtesy had blossomed into something she looked forward to with an intensity that surprised her. Corvin proved to be an exceptional companion, learned without being condescending, curious about her simple life without seeming to judge it, and possessed of a dry wit that could make her laugh in ways she hadn't since Henrik's death. Their conversations ranged from philosophy to poetry, from village gossip to ancient history, and she found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she'd kept locked away for years. Tonight, she carried a small bundle wrapped in linen, fresh bread from her morning's baking, and a pair of thick socks she'd knitted from her softest wool. It had become her custom to bring small gifts, partly from habit and partly because she'd noticed how his face lit up when she presented them, as if no one had thought to offer him such simple kindnesses in centuries. The keep's entrance hall welcomed her with its familiar warmth, and Mirabelle greeted her with what might have been a smile on her ageless face. His lordship awaits you in the music room tonight, my lady. He has something special he wishes to share. The music room was a chamber Elswyth had glimpsed, but never entered a circular space in one of the towers, with tall windows that offered sweeping views of the mountain peaks. Tonight, candles filled every niche and corner, their light reflecting off polished instruments that lined the walls. A violin rested in an ornate case, a lute hung beside sheets of hand-copied music, and in the center of the room stood a harpsichord whose ivory keys gleamed like teeth in the flickering light. Corvin rose from a chair beside the harpsichord as she entered, his usual composed, the expression touched with something that looked almost like boyish excitement. "Elswyth," he said, and she noticed he'd begun using her given name without the formal address. "I thought tonight you might enjoy hearing something from the years before my transformation. Music has a way of preserving memory that words cannot." She settled into the chair he indicated, placing her small bundle on a nearby table. "I would love that. Henrik and I rarely had opportunity to hear music beyond hymns and folk songs." Corvin's fingers moved over the harpsichord keys with practiced grace, drawing forth a melody that seemed to transform the very air around them. The music was complex yet accessible, mathematical precision wedded to profound emotion. As the notes flowed through the room, Elswyth felt transported to another time, another world where such beauty was commonplace. "Bach," Corvin said when the piece concluded. "Johann Sebastian, a contemporary of mine during my early years as well as what I became. I had the privilege of hearing him play in Leipzig once. Extraordinary man." "You knew Bach?" Elswyth's voice carried wonder and a touch of disbelief. "Briefly. The musical world was smaller then, and I was still young enough in my condition to seek out human company." His expression grew distant. "Before I learned how dangerous such connections could become." She wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his tone warned her away from pressing. Instead, she gestured toward the room's collection of instruments. "Do you play them all?" "Most of them." Music became a refuge when human companionship grew too costly. He rose and moved to a glass case she hadn't noticed before, set into an alcove near the windows. "But there's something else I wanted to show you, something I haven't looked at in many decades." The case contained a small wooden music box, its surface carved with intricate roses and vines that matched the pattern on his seal. Even in the candlelight, she could see the craftsmanship was extraordinary, every petal and thorn rendered with loving detail. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering over the case's latch. "Of course." He lifted the music box with careful reverence, as if it were made of spun glass rather than carved wood. When he opened the lid, a tiny figure of a dancing woman rose from the center, while a hauntingly beautiful melody began to play simple notes that seemed to carry the weight of lost worlds. But as the music filled the room, Corvin's composed expression began to crumble. His hands trembled slightly, and she saw pain flash across his features like lightning across a storm-darkened sky. "Marguerite," he whispered, the name barely audible above the music box's tinkling melody. The transformation was startling. The controlled, elegant lord who had become her friend seemed to fold inward, centuries of carefully maintained composure giving way to raw, devastating grief. He sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him, the music box clutched to his chest. "She gave this to me," he continued, his voice breaking. "The woman I was to marry before everything changed. She had it made for my birthday, commissioned from a craftsman in Paris. Said the melody reminded her of the first dance we shared." Elswyth felt her heart constrict with sympathy. Without thinking, she rose and moved to his side, one hand reaching out to touch his shoulder in comfort. The moment her fingers made contact, he flinched as if burned. "Don't," he said sharply, then immediately gentled his tone. "Please, Elswyth. Physical contact is. It's been so long since I've touched another person that I'm not certain I can control myself." But she didn't withdraw her hand. Instead, she let it rest lightly on his shoulder, offering what comfort she could. "Tell me about her." For a moment she thought he might refuse. Then, as the music box continued its bittersweet song, the words began flowing like water from a broken dam. She was the daughter of a neighboring lord, bright as sunlight, kind beyond measure, with a laugh that could make the darkest day seem bright. We'd known each other since childhood, but love came gradually, growing from friendship into something deeper. His voice carried the weight of centuries of grief. "We were to be married in the spring. I was planning to gift her a library. She loved books as much as I did, and we dreamed of traveling together, of seeing all the wonders the world held. What happened? I was bitten 3 weeks before our wedding day. By the time I understood what had been done to me, what I had become, the hunger was already taking hold. I couldn't." He stopped, his whole body shaking with the force of suppressed emotion. "I couldn't risk being near her. Couldn't chance hurting the one person who meant everything to me. So you left." "I disappeared in the night like a coward. Left her a letter saying I'd realized I couldn't marry her, that I was releasing her from our engagement. Let her think I'd simply changed my mind rather than reveal the truth." The music box wound down, its final notes echoing in the sudden silence. Corvin's shoulders shook with 3 centuries of accumulated grief, and Elswyth found herself holding him as she might comfort a wounded child, her own eyes burning with unshed tears. "She died believing you stopped loving her," she whispered. "Yes," he said simply, "and I've carried that knowledge every day since." The look in her eyes when she read my letter, I saw it from the forest where I was hiding. Confusion, then hurt, then a kind of death that had nothing to do with stopping hearts. I killed something in her that day, something beautiful and trusting, and she never recovered from it. They sat in silence as night deepened around the keep, 2 souls bound by understanding of loss that cuts deeper than death. Finally, Elswyth spoke the words that had been building in her. "Heart, she would have wanted you to find happiness again, you know. Love like that doesn't seek to bind, it seeks to bless." Corvin looked up at her then, his storm-grey eyes swimming with tears he couldn't shed. "How can you be so certain?" "Because that's what real love does," she said simply. "It gives permission to heal." The weeks that followed their evening with the music box brought a subtle shift in their relationship. As if Corvin's vulnerability had broken down barriers neither had fully realized existed. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal, and Elswyth found herself sharing memories of Henrik she'd never spoken aloud, not just the happy recollections, but the difficult truths about their childless marriage and the quiet grief that had shadowed their later years. But she also began to notice things about Corvin that his careful courtesy had previously hidden. The way he sometimes gripped his chair arms until his knuckles went white. How his eyes would occasionally flash with something predatory before he quickly looked away. The careful distance he maintained even during their most intimate conversations, as if he were fighting a constant internal battle. It was during their 6th weekly visit that the careful balance finally shattered. They were in his study, discussing a book of poetry he'd lent her, when she noticed his distraction. His responses came slower than usual, and his gaze kept drifting to her throat, where her pulse beat visibly beneath pale skin. When she reached for her teacup, their hands accidentally brushed, and he jerked back as if she'd burned him. "Corvin," she said softly. "What's wrong?" He rose abruptly, moving to stand before the fireplace with his back to her. In the dancing light, she could see the tension radiating through his entire frame. "You should go," he said, his voice strained. "Tonight it's not safe for you to be here." "Not safe how?" "The hunger is stronger tonight. I haven't fed in nearly a week, and your presence—" He stopped, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Your warmth, your scent, the sound of your heartbeat. It's becoming difficult to remember why I shouldn't simply take what I need." Fear should have flooded through her at his words. Instead, Elswyth felt only concern for the man who was clearly fighting a battle with his own nature. She rose and moved toward him, ignoring his sharp intake of breath as she approached. "How do you usually feed?" she asked calmly. He turned to face her, and she saw the struggle written plainly across his features. His eyes had darkened to nearly black, and when he spoke, she caught a glimpse of fangs. "I hunt in the deep forest, take deer and other large game. It sustains me, though it's not," he paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. "It's not what this body truly craves." "Human blood." "Yes." The admission came out like a confession of sin, but I swore long ago never to take from a mutt innocence. Better to exist on an inadequate diet than become the monster the stories paint me as. Elswyth studied his face, noting the gaunt quality that had become more pronounced over their weeks together. "You're starving yourself." "I'm maintaining control." "No," she said firmly. "You're wasting away out of misguided nobility." Before he could respond, she began unfastening the high collar of her dress. "Take what you need." "Absolutely not." He backed away from her, his voice sharp with horror. "Elswyth, you don't understand what you're suggesting." "I understand perfectly." She stepped closer, ignoring his retreat. "You need blood to survive. I have blood to spare, and I trust you not to take more than necessary." "Trust me?" He laughed bitterly. "You shouldn't. The hunger isn't rational, isn't controllable once it begins. I could drain you dry before my sanity returned." "Could you?" she challenged. "Or is that fear talking? Fear of losing control? Fear of becoming like whoever created you? Fear of allowing someone to care enough to help you?" Her words struck home. She saw it in the way he flinched. For a long moment they stood facing each other, two people who had found connection in the most unlikely circumstances, separated by the fundamental differences in what they were. Then Corvin's careful control snapped. He moved faster than human sight could follow, suddenly close enough that she could feel the chill radiating from his skin. His hands framed her face, and she saw the hunger blazing in his darkened eyes like a living thing. "You don't know what you're offering," he whispered, his voice rough with need. "Then show me," she replied steadily. For a heartbeat that felt like eternity, he struggled with himself. Then his head dropped to the curve of her neck, and she felt the sharp pressure of fangs against her skin. But instead of the violent attack she'd half expected, his bite was almost gentle, a careful puncture followed by drawing pressure that sent unexpected warmth flooding through her veins. The sensation was unlike anything she'd experienced. Not painful, but intensely intimate, as if he were taking more than just blood, as if he were drawing something essential from her very soul. She felt him shudder against her, heard a sound that might have been relief or anguish, or both. When he finally pulled away, his eyes had returned to their normal grey, and something fundamental had shifted between them. He touched the small wound at her throat with trembling fingers, his expression a mixture of gratitude and self-loathing. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never meant for you to. Don't apologize." Her voice was softer than usual but steady. "Not for accepting help when you need it." Their gazes met and held, and in that moment both of them understood that their relationship had crossed into territory neither had anticipated. Whatever this was between them, it was no longer just friendship. The spell was broken by a sharp knock at the study door. Mirabelle entered without waiting for permission, her usually serene expression troubled. "My lord, there are visitors at the gate, village men, and they seem quite agitated." Through the tall windows, they could see torchlight moving in the courtyard below. Angry voices carried on the night air, and Elswyth recognized Father Benedict's voice among them. "They've come for me," she realized, her heart sinking. Corvin's expression hardened into something dangerous. "No one takes you from here against your will. Violence won't solve this," she said quickly, recognizing the protective fury building in his eyes. "Let me speak to them. And if they refuse to listen?" She touched his arm gently, feeling him relax slightly at her contact. "Then we'll find another way. But bloodshed will only prove their worst fears about you." Below in the courtyard, Father Benedict's voice rang out clearly. "We know she's here. Send out the widow, creature, before you damn her soul completely." Corvin's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "Very well, but I go with you. That will only inflame them further. I don't care." His eyes met hers with quiet intensity. "You matter more to me than their fear." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Then another shout from below reminded them of the immediate crisis. "Stay close to me," Corvin said as they prepared to face the crowd. "Whatever happens, don't let them separate us." As they descended toward the great hall, Elswyth wondered how her simple desire for companionship had led to this moment, standing beside a creature the village feared, ready to defend feelings she'd never expected to experience again. But looking at Corvin's profile in the flickering torchlight, she realized she regretted nothing. For the first time since Henrik's death, she felt truly alive. The great hall of the Black Keep had never seen such a confrontation. Torchlight from the villagers' procession cast wild shadows across the ancient stones as 24 men crowded through the massive doors. Father Benedict led them, his weathered face set with grim determination, while behind him came merchants, farmers, and craftsmen, men who had never before dared to set foot on the keep's grounds. Corvin stood at the foot of the grand staircase with Elswyth beside him, his posture radiating controlled power despite his outwardly calm demeanor. The villagers stopped just inside the doorway, clearly intimidated by the hall's imposing grandeur and their host's unwavering gaze. "Father Benedict," Corvin said, his voice carrying easily through the vast space, "to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" The priest stepped forward, clutching his wooden cross like a shield. "You know why we're here, creature. Release the widow from whatever spell you've cast over her." "I'm under no spell," Elswyth said firmly before Corvin could respond. I come here of my own free will." "Nonsense, child," Father Benedict replied, though his tone held more sorrow than anger. "No godly woman would willingly consort with such a being unless her mind had been corrupted by dark magic." Merchant Aldrich moved to stand beside the priest, his face pale but resolute. "Elswyth, we're here to help you. Whatever promises he's made, whatever he's shown you, it's all lies. He's a vampire, a creature of hell that feeds on innocent blood." "I know what he is," Elswyth said quietly, and her calm admission sent a shocked murmur through the assembled men. "Then you know the danger?" Father Benedict pressed. "Come away with us now, before it's too late for your immortal soul." "My soul is my own concern," she replied with quiet dignity, "as is my choice of companions." The crowd stirred restlessly, and she heard muttered words about possession and demonic influence. But before the situation could escalate further, Corvin stepped forward, his movement causing several villagers to stumble backward in fear. "There's something you all need to understand," he said, his voice carrying a weight of authority that commanded attention. "Something your ancestors knew, but you've forgotten in your fear." He moved to a massive wooden chest that sat beneath one of the hall's great tapestries. From it, he withdrew a leather portfolio bound with ribbons that had faded with age. The assembled villagers watched with nervous anticipation as he untied the bindings and withdrew a sheet of parchment that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "Do you recognize this, Father Benedict?" The priest squinted at the document, and as comprehension dawned, his face went white. "That's impossible. The covenant of Drailenmere was destroyed generations ago." "This is the original," Corvin said, holding the parchment so the torchlight could illuminate its ancient text. "Written in the year of our Lord 1489, signed by your village's founders and sealed with my blood. Would you like me to read the relevant passages?" Without waiting for an answer, he began to recite in a voice that seemed to echo with centuries of authority. "In exchange for protection from the dark forces that threaten this mountain settlement, Lord Corvin Blackthorn of the Black Keep agrees to serve as guardian and defender of Drailenmere and its people for so long as they shall acknowledge his covenant and show proper respect for the ancient ways." The silence that followed was profound. Elswyth watched the faces of the assembled men transform from anger to confusion to dawning horror as the implications sank in. "You mean," Aldrich's voice cracked, "you're supposed to be protecting us?" "I have protected you," Corvin replied simply. "For over 300 years, I have stood between this village and threats you can't imagine. Shadow creatures that hunt human flesh, blood cults that would sacrifice your children to ancient gods, demons that feed on despair and madness. The mountains are full of such horrors, but they cannot enter Drailenmere because of the protective barriers my presence maintains." Father Benedict sank onto a nearby bench, as if his legs could no longer support him. "The old records, they spoke of a guardian covenant, but we thought it was merely legend. Your ancestors were wiser than their descendants," Corvin said, not unkindly. "They understood that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms. They made a pact with me willingly, offering acknowledgement and respect in exchange for protection. A pact I have honored faithfully despite receiving neither acknowledgement nor respect for generations." From another section of the portfolio he withdrew what appeared to be a map, marked with symbols and notations. "Look here," he said, spreading it on a nearby table. "These marks represent supernatural incursions I've prevented in the last 50 years alone. 12 separate attacks on your village, turned aside before you even knew you were in danger." The map showed the mountain region with Drailenmere at its center, surrounded by protective circles and barriers marked in Corvin's careful script. Dates and descriptions covered the margins, encounters with creatures whose names made several villagers cross themselves in fear. "But why haven't you told us?" asked Thomas the blacksmith, his voice shaking. "Why let us fear you if you're protecting us?" Corvin's expression grew weary. Because fear keeps you cautious. A protected people who grow complacent become vulnerable to threats that can slip past even the strongest wards. Your fear of me has kept you vigilant, alert to supernatural dangers. It was an unpleasant but necessary arrangement. Until now, Elswyth said softly, understanding flooding through her. He nodded, his storm-grey eyes meeting hers with profound sadness. Until now. My connection to humanity had grown so tenuous that the protective barriers were beginning to weaken. I could feel them failing, could sense dark things stirring in the deep places, drawn by the growing gaps in the defenses. From the portfolio's final section, he produced what looked like a crystal compass, its needle spinning wildly before settling on a direction that pointed toward the village's eastern border. The crystal glowed with an ominous red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. "This is a celestial compass," he explained. "It tracks supernatural threats. 3 weeks ago, the night after Elswyth first visited me, it began showing readings I hadn't seen in decades. Something ancient and malevolent has awakened in the deep forest, drawn by the weakening of my protective bonds." Father Benedict looked up from the ancient contract, his face grey with dawning horror. "The night terrors the children have been having, the livestock that have gone missing, the strange lights people have seen in the forest. All signs that the barriers are failing," Corvin confirmed. "When people reject their guardian, the protection weakens. When they deny the covenant entirely," he gestured toward the wildly spinning compass, "the consequences can be catastrophic." "But why is it weakening?" Aldrich demanded. "You're still here, still supposedly protecting us." Corvin glanced at Elswyth, and she saw pain flash across his features. "Because a guardian without connection to humanity becomes merely a monster. The covenant requires not just my presence, but my humanity. For years, I've been losing that connection, becoming more creature than man. The protection I could offer diminished with each passing season. Until Elswyth," Father Benedict said, understanding flickering in his eyes. "Until Elswyth," Corvin agreed. "Her kindness, her acceptance, it reminded me what it felt like to be human. For the first time in decades, I remembered why humanity was worth protecting." The priest rose slowly, his gaze moving between Corvin and Elswyth with new comprehension. "Her visits have been strengthening the barriers." "Yes, but not enough, and perhaps too late." Corvin rolled up the map carefully. "The winter solstice approaches the time when the covenant must be formally renewed. If it fails, if the barriers fall completely, what emerges from the deep forest will not be content to merely threaten Drealenmere. It will spread across the entire mountain region, bringing darkness that could last for generations." The great hall fell silent except for the crackling of torches and the sound of frightened breathing. The villagers who had come to rescue Elswyth from a monster were faced with the terrible realization that the monster might be their only hope for survival. What must be done? Father Benedict asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Corvin's gaze found Elswyth's again, and she saw in his eyes the weight of centuries of loneliness and the crushing burden of duty. The covenant must be renewed willingly, with the full knowledge and acceptance of those it protects, and it requires sacrifice from both the guardian and the community he serves. "What kind of sacrifice?" Elswyth asked, though something in his expression made her fear the answer. "Blood," he said simply, "the guardian's blood to bind the protective power, and the blood of one who speaks for the community, someone who can bridge the gap between human and supernatural, who can serve as the covenant's living seal." The implications hit her like a physical blow. The villagers' rescue mission had become something else entirely, a desperate negotiation for survival that would require the very connection they'd come to sever. The 3 days that followed the revelation in the Great Hall transformed Drealenmere from a village paralyzed by fear into a community united by desperate purpose. News of the ancient covenant spread quickly through whispered conversations and urgent household meetings. Children were kept indoors after dark, livestock was brought closer to the village centre, and every able-bodied man took turns standing watch while the celestial compass's red glow grew steadily brighter. Elswyth found herself at the centre of frantic preparations as word spread that she would serve as the community's representative in the covenant renewal ritual. The same people who had shunned her for months now looked to her with a mixture of hope and terrified respect, as if her willingness to befriend the village's guardian had marked her as somehow blessed or perhaps cursed. Father Benedict had spent 2 sleepless nights poring over the ancient texts in his church's archives, trying to piece together the ritual requirements from fragments of half-remembered lore. What he'd discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The ceremony itself is straightforward, he explained to the gathered villagers in the church hall, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. It must be performed at the stone circle on Raven's Hill during the winter solstice tomorrow night. The guardian and the community representative each offer blood to seal the covenant, and if their sacrifice is accepted by the ancient powers, the protective barriers will be renewed for another generation. And if it's not accepted? Asked Thomas the blacksmith, voicing the fear on everyone's mind. Father Benedict's expression grew grim. Then the barriers fall completely, and whatever darkness has been gathering in the deep forest will be free to spread across the entire mountain region. Merchant Aldrich shifted nervously in his seat. What guarantee do we have that the creature that Lord Corvin won't use the ritual to gain even more power over us? None, Father Benedict admitted. We must trust that his protection of our village for 3 centuries demonstrates his good intentions. The murmur of uneasy agreement that followed was interrupted by young Marta, who had been serving as messenger between the village and the Black Keep. Begging your pardon, Father, but Lord Corvin wishes to meet with you and goodwife Elswyth. He says there are things you need to know about what we'll face tomorrow night. An hour later, Elswyth found herself once again in Corvin's study, but the comfortable intimacy of their previous visits had been replaced by grim urgency. Maps covered every available surface, marked with defensive positions and escape routes. The celestial compass sat on his desk, its red glow now so bright it hurt to look at directly. The readings have worsened, Corvin said without preamble, as Father Benedict examined the ancient charts. Whatever awakened in the deep forest 3 weeks ago has been gathering strength. I estimate we have perhaps a dozen shadow creatures approaching the village perimeter, along with something much older and more dangerous leading them. What kind of something? Father Benedict asked, though his pale expression suggested he dreaded the answer. Corvin pointed to a section of the map marked with symbols that seemed to writhe in the lamplight. An umbral lord, a creature of pure darkness that feeds on despair and terror. They're nearly impossible to kill by conventional means, and their presence corrupts everything around them. If it reaches the village before the barriers are renewed, everyone dies. Elswyth finished quietly. Worse than dies, Corvin corrected. Their souls would be consumed, leaving only empty shells animated by darkness. The corruption would spread like a plague, turning the entire mountain region into a realm of living nightmares. The study fell silent except for the ticking of an ornate clock and the distant sound of wind howling through the mountain passes. Father Benedict set down the map he'd been examining and fixed Corvin with a steady gaze. Tell us about the ritual itself. What exactly does it require from Elswyth? Corvin's expression grew troubled. The ceremony creates a blood bond between guardian and community. In essence, Elswyth becomes the living anchor for the protective spells, her life force intertwining with mine to maintain the barriers. It's not without risks. What kind of risks? Elswyth asked, though something in his tone made her suspect she already knew. The bond is permanent, he said carefully. Once established, it cannot be broken without destroying the protective barriers entirely. Your life will be tied to mine in ways that... He paused, choosing his words with obvious difficulty. In ways that will change you fundamentally. Father Benedict leaned forward in his chair. Change her how? The bond will extend her natural lifespan significantly, allowing her to serve as the Covenant's anchor for centuries rather than decades. She'll develop certain abilities, enhanced senses, limited supernatural perception, resistance to ordinary diseases and injuries. Corvin's gaze found Elswyth's, and she saw apology in his storm-grey eyes. But she'll also become something no longer entirely human. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Elswyth felt the weight of the choice, settling on her shoulders: accept the bond and save her community at the cost of her humanity, or refuse and watch everyone she'd ever cared about be consumed by darkness. There's something else, Corvin continued reluctantly. The bond creates an emotional connection as well as a mystical one. Over time, the guardian and anchor begin to share thoughts, feelings, even memories. It becomes impossible to maintain the barriers without genuine care between them. You mean they must love each other, Father Benedict said bluntly. Love, friendship, deep affection, some form of sincere emotional bond. Yes, the magic requires it. Corvin's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I should have told you this before, Elswyth. Should have explained what accepting this role would truly cost you. She studied his face, noting the guilt and self-recrimination written there. And if I refuse? If we can't find another way? Then I perform the ritual alone, using only my own blood to try to maintain the barriers. It might work for a few years, perhaps a decade if we're fortunate. But without a human anchor, the protection will inevitably fail, leaving the next generation to face what we face now, Father Benedict observed. Or worse, because the umbral Lord will have had time to grow stronger. Elswyth rose from her chair and moved to the tall windows that looked out over the village below. Lights twinkled in dozens of windows, families gathered around their hearths, children safe in their beds, people living ordinary lives they'd taken for granted until 3 days ago. She thought of Henrik and the gentle faith that had guided his every action. He'd believed in taking responsibility for those who couldn't protect themselves, in making sacrifices that served something greater than personal comfort. If he were here now, she knew exactly what choice he would make. I need to understand something, she said, still gazing out at the village lights. This emotional bond the ritual requires, is it something that would be forced on us, or? She turned to face Corvin directly. Do we already have the foundation for what's needed? The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Corvin's carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing a vulnerability that took her breath away. I care for you more than I have cared for anyone in 3 centuries, he said quietly. Whether that constitutes love or merely desperate loneliness, I cannot say. But if we perform this ritual, what I feel will become part of what you feel, and there will be no hiding from the truth of it. Then perhaps it's time for truth, Elswyth replied. I came here tonight thinking about duty and sacrifice and the fate of our village. But that's not the only reason I'm willing to accept the bond. She moved closer to him, close enough to see the hope and fear warring in his eyes. I've spent 7 years believing my capacity for love died with Henrik. But these past weeks with you have awakened something I thought was gone forever. Whether you call it friendship or affection or something deeper, it's real, and it's worth fighting to preserve. Father Benedict cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps I should leave you to discuss the more personal aspects of tomorrow's ceremony. But Corvin shook his head. Father, there's one more thing you need to know. The ritual site on Raven's Hill, it will be under attack from the moment we begin. The shadow creatures will try to disrupt the ceremony at all costs. We'll need every able-bodied man in the village to help defend the circle while the binding is completed. You mean it's not just a ritual, it's a battle? It's both, Corvin confirmed grimly. And if we fail at either aspect, everyone dies. As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed across the valley that made all 3 of them freeze in terror, a howl. that seemed to come from no earthly throat, filled with hunger and malevolent intelligence. The celestial compass on Corvin's desk blazed like a fallen star, its needles spinning wildly before pointing directly toward the village. "They're closer than I thought," Corvin whispered, moving to the window. "The outer perimeter has been breached." In the distance, they could see lights moving through the forest, not the warm glow of torches, but cold, blue flames that seemed to devour the darkness around them. The shadows between the trees writhed with unnatural life, and more of those bone-chilling howls echoed through the night. "Tomorrow night might be too late," Father Benedict said, his voice tight with fear. Corvin's jaw set with grim determination. "Then we move the ceremony to tomorrow at sunset, and we pray that 18 hours is enough time to prepare our defenses." As they watched, one of the moving lights in the forest suddenly flared brighter, and they heard a sound like breaking glass as something struck the invisible barrier surrounding the village. The protection held, but the impact sent visible ripples through the air, like cracks spreading across ice. "The barriers are failing faster now," Corvin observed. "We have perhaps one more day before they collapse entirely." Elswyth reached for his hand, interlacing their fingers with quiet resolve. "Then we'd better make it count." The winter solstice arrived with a sky the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that promised snow before morning. By late afternoon, the entire village had gathered at the base of Raven's Hill, their faces grim with determination, despite the terror that flickered in their eyes. Every man capable of bearing arms carried whatever weapons they could find: pitchforks, hunting knives, axes, and the few old swords that had been passed down through generations. The stone circle at the hill's summit was older than memory, its 12 standing stones arranged in perfect symmetry around a central altar carved with symbols that predated written language. Corvin had spent the morning preparing the site, inscribing protective runes in the frozen earth and arranging the ceremonial implements needed for the covenant renewal. The renewal blade lay upon the ancient altar, a ceremonial sword whose silver surface seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. According to the old texts Father Benedict had found, the blade had been forged specifically for covenant rituals, its metal infused with powers that could channel and bind supernatural forces. Tonight, it would drink the blood of both guardian and anchor, sealing their bond and renewing the protective barriers that stood between Dralenmere and the darkness gathering in the deep forest. "The creatures are massing just beyond the tree line," reported Thomas the blacksmith, returning from his position as forward scout. "Strange lights moving through the woods, and sounds that make your bones ache just to hear them." Corvin nodded grimly as he completed the final preparations. The celestial compass now glowed so brightly it was painful to look at directly, its needles spinning frantically as it tried to track the multitude of supernatural threats converging on their position. "Remember," he addressed the assembled villagers, "your task is to hold the perimeter until the ritual is complete. Don't try to fight the shadow creatures directly. They can only be harmed by blessed weapons or fire. Focus on keeping them away from the inner circle, where Elswyth and I will be performing the ceremony." Father Benedict stepped forward, clutching an ornate silver cross that had belonged to the church for centuries. "I've blessed every weapon I could find and prepared torches soaked in holy water. It should give us some protection against the creatures of darkness." Elswyth stood near the altar, wrapped in a white cloak that made her seem almost ethereal in the gathering dusk. She'd spent the day in prayer and preparation, trying to steel herself for what was to come. The ritual would fundamentally change her, binding her to Corvin and to forces she barely understood. But as she looked down at the village spread below them, at the homes and families depending on their success, she felt no doubt about her choice. "Positions," Corvin called as the first shadows began moving at the forest's edge. The villagers formed a defensive circle around the stone ring, their blessed weapons and torches creating a barrier of light against the encroaching darkness. Father Benedict took his place beside the altar, the ancient ritual text open in his hands, despite the wind that threatened to tear the pages. As full darkness fell, the attack began. Shadow creatures emerged from the forest, like nightmares given form beings of pure darkness that moved with predatory grace and hungered for the warmth of living souls. They flowed across the hillside like spilled ink, their passage leaving the very ground, withered and dead. "Steady!" shouted Merchant Aldrich, raising his blessed sword as the first wave approached. "Remember what we're fighting for." The battle was unlike anything the villagers had ever experienced. The shadow creatures struck without sound, flowing around conventional weapons like smoke. Only the blessed implements could harm them, and even then the effect was temporary. Wounded shadows simply reformed and attacked again with renewed fury. But the villagers held their ground, driven by desperation and the knowledge that failure meant not just death, but something far worse. They fought with the courage of people defending everything they held dear, their torches and blessed weapons carving brief sanctuaries of light in the consuming darkness. At the center of the defensive circle, Corvin began the ancient ritual. His voice rose in words that seemed older than civilization, calling upon powers that had witnessed the birth and death of ages. The renewal blade responded to his invocation, its silver surface beginning to glow with inner fire. "By blood and will, by sacrifice and faith," he intoned, drawing the ceremonial sword across his palm. Dark blood welled from the cut, dropping onto the altar's carved symbols and causing them to flare with brilliant light. The shadow creatures recoiled from the sudden illumination, their forms wavering like smoke in wind. But their retreat was temporary. Already more were emerging from the forest, and something vast and terrible moved behind them. "Elswyth," Corvin called, extending his bleeding hand toward her. "It's time." She stepped forward without hesitation, accepting the renewal blade from his hands. The metal felt warm against her palm despite the bitter cold, and she could sense the power flowing through it, ancient forces waiting to be bound by blood and will. "Together," she said, meeting his storm-grey eyes with steady resolve. As she drew the blade across her own palm, her blood mixed with his on the altar's surface, and the very air around them began to thrum with building power. The stones of the circle started glowing, their light pushing back the darkness and revealing the true scope of the battle raging around them. But even as the ritual's power grew, something emerged from the forest that made every defender's blood turn cold, a figure of absolute darkness that seemed to devour light itself. Moving with terrible purpose toward the stone circle, the Umbral Lord had arrived. The Umbral Lord rose from the darkness like a living void, its form defying comprehension, now a towering shadow with eyes like dying stars, now a writhing mass of tentacles that seemed to exist in dimensions the human mind couldn't process. Where it passed, the very air grew thick and poisonous, and several villagers cried out in despair as its presence touched their minds with visions of endless suffering. "Hold fast!" Father Benedict shouted, his voice cracking with strain as he continued reading from the ritual text. "The ceremony is almost complete." At the altar, Elswyth and Corvin stood with their bleeding hands clasped together over the renewal blade, their combined blood flowing onto the ancient symbols carved into the stone. The power building between them was unlike anything either had experienced, not just magical force, but something deeper and more profound. Their very souls seemed to be reaching toward each other, drawn together by bonds that transcended mere mortality. "I can feel it," Elswyth whispered, her voice filled with wonder and terror. "Your memories, your pain, your loneliness, it's all flowing into me." "And yours into me," Corvin replied, his storm-grey eyes blazing with inner light. "Your faith, your strength, your capacity for love." His voice caught with emotion. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to hope." The Umbral Lord struck the defensive perimeter with the force of a hurricane, its darkness washing over the villagers. Like a tide of despair, Several men fell to their knees, overwhelmed by visions of their deepest fears made manifest. But others stood firm, their blessed weapons carving brief sanctuaries of light in the consuming shadow. "The barriers are strengthening," Corvin observed, noting how the stone circle's glow was growing brighter with each drop of blood they offered. "But it may not be enough. The umbral lord is too powerful, it's breaking through the outer defenses." As if responding to his words, the creature of absolute darkness surged forward, its presence causing the very stones of the circle to crack under the strain. Thomas the blacksmith screamed as shadow tendrils wrapped around his blessed sword, the metal dissolving like sugar in rain. "The ritual," Father Benedict shouted over the sound of battle. "Complete the ritual now, before it's too late." Corvin raised the renewal blade high above the altar, its silver surface blazing with accumulated power. "By the ancient covenant, by blood freely given, by love that conquers death itself." But before he could complete the binding words, the umbral lord broke through the inner defenses, its darkness washing over the stone circle like a frozen tide. The creature's presence was so overwhelming that several of the standing stones cracked, their light guttering like candles in a gale. "No!" Elswyth cried, feeling the ritual's power beginning to falter. "We're so close." That was when something extraordinary happened. As the umbral lord's darkness pressed against them, as the carefully constructed ceremony threatened to collapse, the love between Elswyth and Corvin blazed forth like a star being born. Their bond, built through weeks of shared conversation, deepened through understanding and acceptance, sealed with blood and sacrifice, suddenly transcended the boundaries of the ritual itself. A crystalline light began to emerge from the altar where their blood had mingled, growing brighter and more beautiful with each passing moment. The heart stone was manifesting a gem of pure love and sacrifice that legends claimed could appear when two souls found perfect unity in the face of ultimate darkness. "Impossible," Corvin breathed, staring at the growing crystal. "The heart stone is a myth. Love makes its own magic," Elswyth whispered, understanding flooding through her as their mental bond completed itself. Through his memories, she could see centuries of loneliness and despair. Through hers, he could feel decades of quiet faith and gentle strength. The heartstone pulsed with radiant light, and suddenly the protective barriers didn't just renew, they evolved, becoming something far greater than the original covenant had ever promised. Love's strengthened power flowed outward from the circle, washing over the hillside and driving back the shadow creatures like morning sun, burning away fog. The umbral lord recoiled with a shriek that shattered windows in the village below, its form wavering as the pure light of the heartstone touched it. For creatures of absolute darkness, such concentrated love and sacrifice was more than painful, it was antithetical to their very existence. By the ancient covenant, renewed and strengthened. Corvin completed the ritual words, his voice now joined by Elswyth's as they spoke in perfect unison. By love that conquers all darkness, by sacrifice freely given, by bonds that death cannot break, let these barriers stand eternal. The heart stone flared with brilliant radiance, and the protective barriers exploded outward with the force of creation itself. The shadow creatures simply ceased to exist, their darkness consumed by overwhelming light. The umbral lord made one final attempt to maintain its form, but the power of the evolved covenant was too much. It dissolved into nothingness with a scream that echoed across dimensions. Silence fell over Raven's Hill like a blessed gift. The villagers slowly rose from their defensive positions, staring in amazement at the stone circle that now glowed with warm, welcoming light. The heart stone hovered above the altar, its crystalline facets reflecting the love that had brought it into being. "It's done," Father Benedict whispered, closing the ritual text with trembling hands. "The covenant is renewed, stronger than it's ever been." Corvin and Elswyth stood at the altar's center, their hands still joined over the renewal blade, their eyes locked on each other's faces. The bond between them was complete now, not just magical, but emotional and spiritual as well. They were no longer entirely human or entirely supernatural, but something new, guardians, bound by love rather than duty. Forever, Elswyth whispered. Forever, Corvin agreed, and in that moment both of them knew that their lonely years were finally over. Spring came early to Drealenmere that year, as if the very land itself had awakened from a long, dark dream. Where winter had once lingered well into April, now wild flowers bloomed in March, and the mountain streams ran clear and sweet with snowmelt that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning sun. The villagers whispered that it was the Heartstone's influence, that the love which had saved them all was now blessing the earth itself with renewed life. 6 months had passed since the night on Raven's Hill, and the changes were visible everywhere. The protective barriers that now surrounded Drealenmere glowed with a warm, welcoming light that could be seen from miles away, drawing travellers and merchants who spoke of feeling an inexplicable sense of peace as they approached the village. Trade flourished as never before, and children played freely in the forests that had once been too dangerous to enter. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the relationship between the village and its guardians. The cottage at the edge of Drealenmere had been expanded over the winter months, its rooms brightened with new windows and filled with books from Corvin's extensive library. It served now as both home and meeting place, where villagers could seek counsel or simply enjoy the company of two people who had become beloved rather than feared. Elswyth stood in her garden on this particular morning, marvelling at how the spring vegetables had grown with unprecedented vigour. The Heartstone, now kept in a place of honour on her mantelpiece, seemed to bless everything it touched with abundant life. She could feel its gentle warmth even here, a constant reminder of the night when love had literally saved the world. "The tomatoes are flowering already," Corvin observed, emerging from the cottage with a cup of tea steaming in his hands. The morning ritual of sharing breakfast had become sacred to them, both a daily affirmation of the ordinary pleasures they'd thought lost forever. "Everything grows faster now," she replied, accepting the cup with a smile that still had the power to transform his entire expression. "Young Marta says her mother's roses have bloomed 3 times already this year." The bond between them had settled into something both profound and comfortable. They could sense each other's thoughts and emotions when they chose to, but had learned to maintain the privacy necessary for 2 distinct souls sharing one fate. Corvin's centuries of accumulated knowledge flowed through their connection when needed, while Elswyth's steady faith and practical wisdom helped ground his more esoteric tendencies. "Speaking of young Marta," Corvin said with gentle amusement, "she's bringing another delegation of village children this afternoon. Apparently they want to hear more stories about the olden days." Elswyth laughed, remembering the wonder in the children's eyes during Corvin's tales of distant lands and long-ago adventures. Fear had transformed into fascination as the village realized their guardian was a living link to centuries of history. Children who had once crossed themselves when passing the Black Keep now begged their parents for permission to visit the cottage where the strange lord told stories and their beloved goodwife Elswyth served honeycakes and milk. "Father Benedict is coming as well," she said. "He wants to discuss the summer festival." The priest had become one of their closest friends, his initial terror transforming into deep respect and genuine affection. He'd taken to visiting weekly for theological discussions that could last hours, fascinated by Corvin's first-hand knowledge of historical religious events and comforted by Elswyth's unwavering faith despite her supernatural transformation. A soft knock at the garden gate interrupted their peaceful morning. Merchant Aldrich approached with his usual cheerful greeting, but today he carried news that made both guardians pay closer attention. "Word from the lowlands," he announced, after accepting Elswyth's invitation to share morning tea. "Strange happenings in the coastal. Villages, livestock found drained of blood, crops withering overnight, people reporting nightmares that seemed too real to be dreams." Corvin's expression grew serious as he processed the implications. "The darkness we defeated here may have had relatives." When one umbral lord falls, others sometimes emerge to claim its territory. Will we need to help them? Elswyth asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. We will, Corvin confirmed. The Heartstone's power isn't limited to protecting Draelenmere. With your permission, we could extend our influence to shield other communities from the same threats we faced. The prospect of traveling to distant villages, of helping other communities find their way from fear to hope, filled Elswyth with quiet excitement. It would mean leaving the familiar comfort of their mountain home, but it would also mean fulfilling the deeper purpose their bond had revealed, not just guardianship, but healing the rifts between the mundane and supernatural worlds. Then we'll go, she said simply. Together. Together, he agreed, and the word carried all the weight of their shared commitment. That evening, as had become their custom, they walked to the village square, where her Yuletide basket had once sat abandoned beneath the ancient oak. Now the tree was decorated year-round with ribbons and small gifts from villagers who had learned the joy of anonymous giving. The tradition had spread beyond Elswyth's simple offering to become a community celebration of kindness. Children played safely in the gathering dusk, their laughter echoing off the surrounding mountains. Families shared evening meals with doors and windows open to the warm air, no longer fearful of what darkness might bring. The black keep on its distant hill glowed with welcoming lights, its towers serving as beacons rather than ominous warnings. "Do you ever miss it?" Elswyth asked as they stood beneath the oak's spreading branches. "Your old life, I mean. The solitude and certainty of existing alone?" Corvin considered the question seriously, as he did all her queries about his long existence. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," he admitted. "Loneliness is painful, but it's also predictable. Love requires courage I'd forgotten I possessed. And the immortality, knowing that everyone we care about will eventually age and die while we remain. That was bearable when I cared about no one," he replied quietly. Now, he gestured toward the village around them, at the children playing and families gathering, at the life they'd helped preserve and protect. "Now I think perhaps the point isn't to avoid the pain of loss, but to make the love worth the cost." Elswyth nodded, understanding. The Heartstone had shown them both that love wasn't diminished by its temporary nature. If anything, mortality made connection more precious, not less. As the last light faded from the sky, they walked home hand in hand, ready for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Behind them, the village settled into peaceful sleep under the protection of barriers strengthened by love. And in their cottage, the Heartstone glowed with gentle radiance, a reminder that sometimes the greatest magic comes not from ancient spells or supernatural power, but from the simple choice to keep faith in the goodness of the world. Their story had begun with a basket of kindness left for strangers in the dark. It would continue wherever love was needed to drive away fear, wherever communities required guardians who remembered what it meant to be human.